If you grew up hunting in America, your first deer rifle was probably a Remington Model 700, blued steel and walnut, handed to you on a November morning by a father or grandfather who carried one just like it. At its peak, the Remington plant in Ilion, New York employed 3,000 workers across 3 full shifts. The factory that produced more than 6 million Model 700 rifles and 11 million Model 870 shotguns. They survived the Civil War, survived Imperial Russia defaulting on a 1.5 million rifle order, survived the Great Depression, survived 2 world wars, survived everything the 20th century threw at them, and then, after 208 years of continuous manufacturing in Ilion, the furnaces went cold. How does a company that survived all of that simply disappear? What happened inside those walls? Chapter 1. The furnaces go cold. On the morning of March 4th, 2020, the first shift at the Remington Arms plant in Ilion, New York, was released at 10 o'clock, not at the end of shift, hours early. There was nothing left to build. They filed out through gates that had swung open and shut for over 2 centuries, since before the Civil War, before the typewriter existed, before New York State had paved a single road in the Mohawk Valley. Jim Conover, who'd started at Remington in 1964 and retired decades later, stood outside and told a reporter it was like part of your family had moved off. Frank Rusty Brown, a furnace technician whose mother and father had both worked those same floors, watched co-workers carry out personal items in cardboard boxes. Sandra Fikes, who'd spent 22 years operating machines inside that building, said what a lot of people were thinking. This place could have been booming if they'd had the right people to run it. About 150 people gathered at American Legion Post, 9:20 in the village that afternoon. Not a protest. A send-off. The kind of thing a town does when it buries something it loved. Mayor John Stevens had spent weeks fielding calls from reporters, trying to explain what Remington meant to Ilion, trying to compress 208 years of identity into a soundbite. He'd eventually settled on the simplest version. Ilion is Remington. Remington is Ilion. But that afternoon, standing near the plant whose brick walls ran along the same ground where Eliphalet Remington had forged his first rifle barrel in 2016, Stevens said something else, something quieter. 208 years, he said. Gone. Gone. Men and women alike were crying. The Warren notice filed with New York State listed 309 of 310 workers terminated. 28 would stay through June to decommission the building, to drain the fluids, mothball the machines, and lock the doors on America's oldest gunmaker. The plant that once employed 3,000 people across 3 full shifts, where families had worked 4 and even 5 generations deep, where the Model 700 bolt-action rifle and the Model 870 pump shotgun had been built by the millions, was finished. Outside, the village of Ilion, population 7,600, braced for what came next. Stevens estimated the revenue loss at nearly $1 million a year, mostly from the municipal electric utility that had powered Remington's machines at a discount rate negotiated back in 2010. Debbie Mullen, whose brother and cousins worked inside, said she was going to cry. Robin Collins said what the geography made obvious. You can't take Ilion out of Remington. Dan Sheffield, who'd watched the decline unfold over years, compared it to losing a loved one to a prolonged illness. You saw it coming. You couldn't stop it. And when it finally happened, the grief was no smaller for having been expected. This is a story about how something that survived everything, 2 centuries of wars, depressions, revolutions, and industry upheaval, was destroyed in barely a generation. And it begins not in a boardroom or a bankruptcy court, but at a forge in a river valley, with a young man who couldn't afford to buy a gun. Chapter 2. A barrel forged by hand. Eliphalet Remington II was born on October 28, 1793 in Suffield, Connecticut, to a family that worked iron for a living. His father, Eliphalet Sr., operated a forge, not a gun shop, a forge, converting cast iron into wrought iron, producing the blunt necessities of a country still being carved from the wilderness: axes, wedges, plowshares, crowbars. Around 1800, the family relocated west to the Mohawk Valley in central New York State, settling near a place called Ilion Gulch. The senior Remington set up his forge there alongside the creek, and for the next 2 decades he hammered iron into the tools that settlers needed to clear land, build houses, and break ground. The original family home at Kinney Corners, the Remington House, built around 1810, still stands. It went on the National Register of Historic Places in 1997, long after the family name had become synonymous with something else entirely. Eliphalet II married in 1814. His son Philo was born in 1816, the same year the story really begins. The legend goes like this. At 23, young Eliphalet wanted a rifle but couldn't afford one. By the most common telling, his father refused him the money. So he did what a blacksmith's son in the early 19th century would do. He made one. He forged a rifle barrel from wrought iron in his father's forge, using the same techniques he'd learned shaping farm tools. Then he carried that barrel roughly 10 miles on foot to a gunsmith in Utica. One account names him as Riley Rogers. To have it reamed and rifled, the spiral grooves cut that would make a bullet spin true. He finished the rest of the rifle himself: the lock, the stock, the fittings. That autumn, he entered a local shooting match. He finished second, and the orders started coming in. It's a founding story almost too perfect to be true, and scholars have spent a century and a half trying to figure out how much of it actually happened. The American Society of Arms Collectors, in their monograph, Remington: The Early Years, traced the tale back to roughly 1872, more than 50 years after the supposed event. The 1820 census listed no gun materials at all among the forge's products. Historians accept that it is, as the monograph notes, unlikely that a country boy would have possessed the skills to make up an entire flintlock rifle from scratch. The consensus is more modest. Eliphalet II forged a barrel, probably a good one, and that was enough. What matters isn't whether the legend is perfectly true. What matters is what happened next, because the barrel worked. The accuracy spoke for itself. And in a country where a rifle wasn't a luxury or a hobby, but the tool that fed your family and defended your homestead, a man who could forge a straight barrel had a trade that would never go hungry. Within a few years, young Remington was producing barrels steadily from his father's forge. The work was brutal and precise. You started with a flat bar of wrought iron, heated it white-hot in the forge fire until the metal was soft enough to shape, then hammered it around a mandrel, a steel rod the diameter of the bore you wanted, folding the iron over itself, lap welding the seam with each blow, building the tube 1 inch at a time. The hammering alone could take hours. When the tube was formed, you ground the exterior smooth on a water-powered grinding wheel, reamed the bore to a uniform diameter, then cut the rifling grooves with a hand-crank tool that advanced a fraction of a turn with each pass. The finished barrel was tested by loading it with an overcharge and firing it into a dirt bank. If it held, it shipped. If it burst, you started over. Every barrel was a handmade object. There was no shortcut, no mass production technique that could substitute for the skill of a man who understood what iron did under heat, who could feel through the hammer handle whether the weld had taken or left a void that would crack under pressure. By 1828, the operation was producing more than 8,000 barrels a year. Not rifles, barrels. The guns themselves were often assembled by other smiths in their own shops, But the barrel was the heart of any firearm, the component that determined whether a shot flew straight or scattered at 50 yards. And Remington barrels had a reputation that traveled faster than the product itself. 3 years earlier, in 1825, the Erie Canal had opened. It was the transformative infrastructure project of early America, 363 miles of artificial waterway connecting the Hudson River at Albany to Lake Erie at Buffalo, cutting through the Mohawk Valley on the way. For isolated rural manufacturers in central New York, the canal changed everything. Raw materials that had arrived by ox cart could now come by barge. Finished goods that had been sold only to local markets could now reach New York City, the Great Lakes, and points beyond. The canal didn't just move freight, it moved ambition. In 1828, the same year Eliphalet Sr. died, the Remingtons bought 100 acres along the canal near Morgan's Landing, the settlement that would become the village of Ilion. Eliphalet the Sioux assumed full control of the business. The location was strategic. Canal access for shipping, the Mohawk River for water power, and flat ground along the valley floor for a proper factory. The forge at Ilion Gulch had been adequate for a small barrel-making operation. The new site on the canal was built for something larger, and larger is what it became. The firm grew from E. Remington to E. Remington and Son in 1844, when Philo joined formally, then to E. Remington and Sons as Samuel and Eliphalet III came aboard. The Remingtons pioneered the first successful cast steel drilled rifle barrel made in the United States, a manufacturing advance that improved accuracy, durability, and consistency over the older wrought iron forging method. They weren't just making barrels anymore. They were making guns. The military contracts came next, and they changed the nature of the business. 5,000 Model 1841 Mississippi rifles, a percussion cap muzzle loader that had earned its nickname with Jefferson Davis's Mississippi Regiment during the Mexican-American War, came to Remington after the original contractor defaulted. Taking over a failed contract wasn't glamorous, but it was transformative. It forced the Remingtons to tool up for complete rifle production, not just barrels, and it put the family name on a federal procurement list that would prove invaluable in the decade ahead. In 1848, Remington delivered 1,000 Jenks breech-loading carbines for the United States Navy, the first complete firearms the company ever produced under its own name, designed for shipboard use where the compact carbine format made sense in the cramped quarters below deck. The Navy contract was small by later standards, but it established something crucial. Remington could build a finished weapon from raw steel to final proof, not just a component. After Samuel Colt's revolver patent expired in 1857, opening the handgun market to competition, Remington entered the business with the Fordyce Beals-designed Remington Beals revolver. Beals was a gifted mechanical designer who understood that the revolver's future lay in solid frame construction, a one-piece frame that was stronger and more rigid than Colt's open-top design. The decision to hire Beals and invest in revolvers would prove critical within 4 years, when the country tore itself apart and every cavalryman, officer, and artilleryman in the Union Army needed a sidearm. By the late 1850s, the forge at Ilion Gulch had become a factory on the Mohawk. The barrels that had once been shaped by a single young man's hammer were now produced by a workforce measured in dozens, then hundreds. The Remington name was on contracts from Washington to the frontier. The Erie Canal barges carried crates stamped with an octagonal barrel mark that gunsmiths across the expanding nation had learned to trust. Eliphalet II had built something that mattered. Not a fortune, not yet, but a reputation. And in 1861, that reputation was about to be tested by the largest military procurement in American history. Chapter 3. Blood and Iron. The Civil War hit the Remington works at Ilion like an electric current. The Union Army needed firearms faster than the national armories at Springfield and Harper's Ferry could produce them, and private manufacturers with existing capacity were suddenly indispensable. Remington won contracts for revolvers, the 36 and 44 caliber models that would become the 1863 New Model Army, a sidearm carried by Union cavalry and officers from Gettysburg to Appomattox, and for the Model 1863 percussion contract rifle, a muzzle loader known as the Zouave that soldiers and collectors would later call one of the finest military rifles of its era. The Ilion factory expanded to meet orders that seemed to arrive faster than the ink could dry. Workers arrived from farms and villages across the Mohawk Valley. The octagonal, stamped barrels shipped south by the crate-load, bound for quartermasters who couldn't get weapons into soldiers' hands quickly enough. But Eliphalet Remington Sekou didn't live to see his company's wartime peak. He died on August 12, 1861, 4 months after Fort Sumter, before the largest battle orders had arrived. He was 67 years old. He'd spent 45 years building a barrel-making operation into a firearms company with a national reputation. The three sons took over, Philo as president, Samuel and Eliphalet III as partners. They ran the company through 4 years of war and out the other side. What they found on the other side wasn't pretty. The end of the Civil War in 1865 brought the same disaster it delivered to every American arms maker. The government canceled its contracts overnight, flooded the surplus market with cheap military weapons that undercut new production, and left private manufacturers sitting on factory capacity they'd built for wartime demand that no longer existed. Remington had expanded to fill Union orders. Now those orders were gone. The expansion costs remained, and the civilian market couldn't absorb the difference. The Remingtons reorganized as a joint stock company that year, trying to absorb the financial blow. They needed a product that could sell in peacetime to customers who weren't the United States Army. They found one. The Remington Rolling Block, a breech-loading action designed by Joseph Ryder and Leonard Geiger, patented in the mid-1860s, temporarily saved the company from bankruptcy. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity, a rotating breech block locked by the hammer, strong enough to handle the new metallic cartridges, fast to reload, and almost impossible to break. It was the right gun at the right moment. The world's armies were converting from muzzle loaders to breech loaders, and the rolling block offered a proven, affordable design. The export business that followed was staggering. France bought rolling blocks. So did Egypt, Spain, Argentina, Mexico, Sweden, and Denmark. Governments on 4 continents adopted a rifle designed and manufactured in a village in upstate New York, a reach that would have been unimaginable to Eliphalet Sue's generation, when the furthest a Remington barrel traveled was the Ohio frontier. At a moment when American manufacturing was still largely regional, when most factories sold within their own state or territory, Remington firearms were circling the globe. The rolling block didn't just save the company. It made the Remington name international. But the Remingtons didn't stop at guns. In a diversification push that would seem bizarre by modern standards, but made perfect sense in the precision metalworking economy of the 1870s, Remington began producing typewriters. On March 1, 1873, the first Scholes & Glidden typewriter rolled off the line in Ilion, built by gunsmiths who applied the same tolerances they used on trigger mechanisms to the key levers and type bars of a writing machine. That typewriter introduced the QWERTY keyboard layout that 2 billion people still use today. The Remington No. 2, released in 1878, added the shift key, another innovation born in Ilion that outlived the company by generations. Remington also manufactured sewing machines, agricultural implements, and bicycles. The same workforce that rifled barrels in one department assembled typewriter carriages in another. The typewriter line was a genuine success, but it couldn't carry the weight of everything else. By the mid-1880s, the Remington enterprise was overextended. The typewriter division was sold off in 1886, bought by employees Wyckoff, Benedict, and Siemens, who would build it into Remington Rand, eventually a separate corporate lineage entirely. The sale was a warning sign. The gun business was struggling. The diversification hadn't produced enough revenue to offset the post-war military contraction. The family was running out of room. On March 7, 1888, 72 years after Ilion II forged his first barrel, the Remington family sold E. Remington and Sons. The buyers were Marcellus Hartley and Partners, Hartley and Graham, a prominent New York sporting goods firm, and the Union Metallic Cartridge Company of Bridgeport, Connecticut, the ammunition maker whose products loaded the very rifles Remington built. Winchester Repeating Arms briefly held a stake in the new enterprise before selling it to Hartley in 1896. The company was renamed the Remington Arms Company. The Remington family was out. 3 generations, Eliphalet Sr. at the forge, Eliphalet II building the business from a single barrel to a global brand, the 3 sons carrying it through the Civil War and its aftermath. And now the name belonged to someone else. But the factory stayed. The workers stayed. And Ilion, which had grown up around the forge the way a mill town grows around the water wheel that feeds it, kept punching the clock. Marcellus Hartley understood what he'd purchased. Not just a factory, a reputation, a brand that had armed the Union, sold rifles to half the monarchies of Europe, and invented a keyboard layout that stenographers were already learning in typing schools from Boston to San Francisco. When Hartley died in 1902, leadership passed to his grandson, Marcellus Hartley Dodge. In 1912, Remington Arms merged with the Union Metallic Cartridge Company to form Remington UMC, consolidating guns and ammunition under one roof. The new entity had manufacturing in Ilion for firearms and Bridgeport for ammunition. It had government contacts, an export network, and a name that carried weight. What it didn't have, and what it desperately needed, was a way to survive the next catastrophe. Because in the summer of 1914, the catastrophe arrived from Europe, and it was bigger than anything the Remingtons had ever faced. Chapter 4. The Russian Catastrophe and the Chemist's Rescue. When the guns of August opened the First World War, the warring powers of Europe discovered within months that their own arsenals couldn't keep pace with the slaughter. They turned to American manufacturers. Remington UMC was among the first they called. The contracts were enormous. Pattern 1914, Enfield rifles for Britain, the bolt-action infantry weapon that British and later American troops would carry across the Western Front. M0907, 15, Berthier rifles for France. And from Imperial Russia, an order that dwarfed everything else, 1.5 million Model 1891 Mosin-Nagant rifles. The Tsar's army was bleeding through its rifle supply faster than Russian factories could replace it, and Remington agreed to fill the gap. The scale of the production ramp-up was extraordinary. In Ilion, factory expansion began in late 1914 to fulfill the British Enfield order, with construction work by the James Stewart Company, documented in photographs dated March 1915, new buildings rising alongside the old ones, the footprint of the plant swelling to meet a demand that seemed to have no ceiling. In Bridgeport, Remington UMC's rifle works grew into what was said to be the largest factory in the world, 1 million square feet spread across 4 floors. At peak, the Bridgeport plant alone was producing between 4,000 and 4,200 Russian Mosin-Nagant rifles per day, plus 10,000 bayonets daily. The production lines ran around the clock. The Mohawk Valley hummed with the sound of a country building weapons for someone else's war. Remington produced roughly 750,000 of the Russian rifles. Of those, 469,000 951, were delivered to Russia before October 1917. Then came the revolution. The Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar's government that autumn, and the new regime had no interest in honoring the old regime's contracts. Russia had never actually paid for the rifles. The Bolshevik government defaulted, leaving Remington and its co-contractor, New England Westinghouse, holding hundreds of thousands of completed rifles with no buyer and massive debts from the production expansion. The financial blow was severe enough to threaten the survival of both companies. The United States government stepped in, not out of charity, but out of strategic necessity. America had entered the war in April 1917 and needed rifles for its own rapidly expanding army. The government purchased roughly 280,000 of the remaining Mosin Nagants, designating them the U.S. Rifle 7.62 model of 1916, and distributed them for training and rear echelon use. The purchase price wasn't generous, but it was enough to keep Remington and Westinghouse from going under. It was the first time the company had nearly died. It wouldn't be the last. The 1920s brought peace and contraction. Military orders evaporated. The sporting firearms market couldn't absorb the capacity that wartime production had built. Remington UMC limped through the decade, and when the Great Depression hit in 1929, the company found itself in the same position as thousands of American manufacturers, overbuilt, underfunded, and facing a consumer market that had collapsed. The rescue, when it came, arrived from Wilmington, Delaware. In 1933, E.I. Dupont de Nemours and Company, DuPont, the chemical giant, acquired a controlling interest in Remington Arms. The strategic logic was vertical integration. DuPont manufactured gunpowder and smokeless propellants, and Remington manufactured guns and ammunition. Owning both ends of the supply chain made industrial sense. DuPont reorganized the firm as Remington Arms Company, Inc. in 1934, merged it with the Peters Cartridge Company to expand ammunition capacity, and funded the construction of new facilities, including an ammunition plant in Lonoke, Arkansas. DuPont brought something that no previous Remington ownership had possessed: deep pockets backed by patience. This wasn't a leveraged purchase. It wasn't a financial play. DuPont was one of the largest industrial corporations on Earth, a blue-chip titan with roots stretching back to 1802. And it treated Remington the way a prosperous family treats a valuable piece of land, as something to be developed over decades, not stripped for quick returns. The capital that flowed into Ilion from Wilmington wasn't borrowed against Remington's own assets. It came from DuPont's chemical profits, from a parent company so large that Remington's fortunes barely registered on the corporate balance sheet. That stability would prove essential, because within 8 years, the world would need Remington again. And this time, the orders wouldn't be for someone else's army. When the United States entered the Second World War after Pearl Harbor, Remington's Ilion plant became part of the arsenal that would supply the largest military mobilization in human history. The War Department needed rifles, specifically the M103 Springfield, the bolt-action workhorse that had served American forces since the early 1900s. Springfield Armory couldn't produce them fast enough alone. Remington received the contract. Production began in September 1941, using tooling shipped by trainload from Rock Island Arsenal. The early rifles were the standard M1903, but by May 1942, the Army had standardized a simplified variant, the M1903A3, redesigned for faster, cheaper mass production without sacrificing the accuracy that made the Springfield a soldier's rifle. Remington produced a total of over 133,000 of the earlier variation alone, and the A3 production that followed dwarfed it. The Ilion workforce expanded to meet the demand. Women entered the factory in numbers the Mohawk Valley had never seen. They were called the Remington Girls, the Ilion version of Rosie the Riveter, Among them were sisters Iva and Avis Curley, who came to work in 1943. Iva operated a drill press, boring the peep sight holes on rifle receivers. "Our soldiers' lives depended on it," she'd later say, and she wasn't exaggerating. A misaligned sight meant a rifle that shot wide, and in combat, a rifle that shot wide was the difference between a soldier who came home and one who didn't. Avis worked the ammunition line. Together, the two sisters represented something the Mohawk Valley had never quite experienced before. Women not just supporting the war effort from home, but standing on the factory floor doing precision work that had once been considered men's labor exclusively. During the war years, Main Street in Ilion ran right through the middle of the Remington factory. The plant had grown so large, so intertwined with the village, that the public road literally passed between buildings. You couldn't drive through town without driving through Remington. It was a physical fact that expressed something the community already knew. There was no separating the factory from the place. Remington also operated government-owned facilities beyond Ilion, including the Lake City Army ammunition plant in Missouri, producing the vast tonnages of cartridges and shells that a global war consumed at rates the pre-war planners had barely imagined. Smith and Corona, the typewriter manufacturer in Syracuse, 70 miles east of Ilion, was brought in to expand M1-3 production further. One more manufacturer drafted into the effort. By the war's end in 1945, Remington Arms had survived its Second World War, its second near-death experience, and its second reinvention. The DuPont parent had provided the capital and stability that made wartime production possible. The Ilion workforce had proven it could scale to meet any demand. And the factory, the same ground where Eliphalet Remington had forged a barrel from wrought iron in 1816, had anchored its place in the American Defense Industrial Base. Now, with peace restored and the soldiers coming home, Remington was about to enter the richest, most creative, most culturally significant chapter in its long history. The guns it built in the next 2 decades wouldn't just arm soldiers. They'd become part of the fabric of American life, passed from fathers to sons, carried into autumn woods, racked above mantels in homes from Maine to Montana. They'd become heirlooms. And the factory that made them would become something close to sacred. Chapter 5. Big Green's Golden Age. The war ended. The soldiers came home. And in Ilion, New York, the Remington Arms Company, backed by DuPont's deep capital reserves, staffed by a workforce that had just spent 4 years proving it could build anything the War Department asked for, turned its full attention to the American sportsman. The first masterpiece arrived in 1950. The Model 870 pump-action shotgun was the work of a design team led by L. Ray Crittenden with Philip Haskell, Ellis Hailston, and G.E. Pinckney. The brief was deceptively simple. Build a pump shotgun that was stronger, smoother, and more reliable than anything on the market at a price that a working man could justify. What they produced was a gun so well engineered that its basic design wouldn't need to change for the next 70 years. The 870's action was machined from a solid steel receiver, not stamped from sheet metal the way some competitors cut corners. And the pump stroke was glass smooth, a quality that shooters noticed the first time they worked the slide. The initial offering was the Wingmaster grade, with a polished blued finish and fine-line checkering on the walnut stock and forend that made it look like it cost twice what Remington was charging. Hunters carried it into duck blinds from the Chesapeake to the Central Flyway, into grouse coverts in New England, into dove fields across the Deep South. Police departments adopted it as the standard cruiser gun. The Marine Corps bought them. Deer hunters in slug-only states swore by it. And on the factory floor in Ilion, the 870s rolled off the production line in numbers that climbed year after year, decade after decade, until the total passed 11 million. 11 million pump shotguns from one factory in one village in upstate New York. No other sporting firearm in American history has come close. But the gun that would define Remington's identity for the next half-century arrived 12 years later. The Model 700 bolt-action rifle, introduced in 1962, was designed by a team headed by Merle "Mike" Walker, a Remington engineer who'd spent 37 years at the company and who was, in his own right, one of the finest rifle minds in America. Walker was a bench-rest shooting pioneer, a man who understood accuracy not as a marketing claim, but as a measurable physical property, something you could test at the range and express in fractions of an inch at 100 yards. The Model 700 evolved from Remington's earlier bolt-action designs. The Models 721, 722, and 725, produced from 1948 onward, but Walker and his team refined the action, the bedding, and the trigger into something that felt, in a shooter's hands, like a precision instrument. The first advertisements appeared in the June 1962 issue of American Rifleman. The ADL grade listed at $114.95, the BDL with its finer wood and skip-line checkering at $139.95. The rifle was introduced alongside a brand-new cartridge, the 7mm Remington Magnum, and was chambered for the most popular hunting calibers in America: .22 Remington, .243 Winchester, .270 Winchester, 300 weight Winchester, .30-06 Springfield, and eventually dozens more. It was accurate out of the box in a way that previous factory rifles hadn't been. It was affordable. And it was beautiful. The blued steel barrel and receiver set against an American black walnut stock that was shaped, sanded, and finished by hand in the Ilion walnut shop. That walnut shop was the soul of the operation. Raw walnut blanks arrived from timber suppliers across the eastern United States. Black walnut, the species prized for its strength, its workability, and the rich chocolate-brown color that deepened with age and handling. Each blank was selected for grain straightness, density, and the particular figuring patterns that made a stock not just functional, but handsome. The blanks were rough cut to shape, then passed through a progression of machines and hands. Inlet for the barreled action, shaped on duplicating lathes, hand-sanded to final contour, checkered by workers who'd spent years learning the diamond patterns that gave grip and beauty simultaneously, then finished with coats of oil or lacquer, applied and rubbed until the grain glowed. The best stocks, the ones that went into BDL grades and custom shop rifles, were works of functional art, each one slightly different because the grain of every walnut tree is unique. A walnut stock that came off the line at Ilion in the 1960s or 1970s was a piece of craftsmanship that you could feel in your hands. The warmth of the wood against the cold of the blued steel. The way the cheek piece fit your face when you shouldered the rifle. The weight distributed in a way that felt balanced and purposeful, rather than heavy. The 870 and the 700 were the flagships, but the fleet was deep. The Model 1100 semi-automatic shotgun, introduced in 1963, used a gas-operated action that tamed recoil enough to make all-day shooting comfortable. It became the most popular auto-loading shotgun in the country, with production eventually crossing 4 million. The Model 760 pump-action rifle gave deer hunters who preferred a slide action the same Remington reliability they trusted in the 860. The Nylon 66, introduced in 1959, was a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle with a stock molded from DuPont's Zytel nylon, a collaboration between gunmaker and chemical parent that produced a lightweight, nearly indestructible rifle that introduced millions of American kids to shooting. Each product line had its own department, its own production flow, its own crew of workers who knew the tooling and the tolerances by feel. The factory floor where all of this happened occupied the multi-story brick buildings along the Mohawk River that had grown in stages since the 1820s. The barrel department ran hot, forge hammers shaping steel blanks into barrel profiles. The deep-hole drilling machines boring out the bore with a precision measured in thousandths of an inch. The button rifling equipment cutting the spiral grooves that spun the bullet. A barrel started as a solid steel bar and emerged as a tube so straight and true that a man could look through it and see a perfect circle of light at the far end. The machining department was cooler but louder. Milling machines, lathes, and seeing the equipment, cutting receivers, bolt assemblies, trigger housings, and the hundreds of small parts that made a firearm function. The finishing department smelled of chemicals. The bluing tanks where steel parts were immersed in hot oxidizing solutions that turned raw machine metal the distinctive blue-black that was Remington's visual signature, a color that resisted corrosion and gave every gun that left the building the same look of restrained authority. And everywhere, the smell that anyone who ever worked there remembers first, gun oil mixed with walnut shavings, the baseline scent of the place, as distinctive as the sulfur and steel smell of a foundry or the cotton dust smell of a textile mill. The company's identity crystallized around a color, Big Green, the brand nickname that came from the distinctive green boxes that Remington ammunition shipped in, and that extended to the company's advertising, its logo, and its public image. A green Remington box on a gun shop shelf was as recognizable to American shooters as a Coca-Cola can was to everyone else. The company didn't need to explain itself. It was Remington. It was Big Green. It had been making guns in the same place since before Abraham Lincoln was born. Chapter 6. A City Within a Village. The people who built those guns came from the same place, generation after generation. Ilion was a company town in everything but the legal definition. Nobody owned your house, nobody ran the store. But the economic gravity of the Remington plant shaped every aspect of life in the village and the surrounding Mohawk Valley, the way a river shapes the land it runs through. At its peak in the 1970s and 1980s, Remington employed roughly 3,000 people in Ilion across 3 full shifts. The morning shift arrived before dawn, headlights sweeping across the parking lot in the pre-sunrise dark. Workers carrying lunch pails and thermoses through the same gate their fathers had used. The afternoon shift punched in as the morning shift filed out, a brief overlap in the lot when both shifts were present, the building at its most crowded, every machine about to change hands. The night shift kept the machines running until the morning crew returned and the cycle started over. The factory whistle, or its modern equivalent, the shift change horn, organized the rhythm of the entire village, the way a church bell organizes a medieval town. Breakfast crowds at the local diners shifted with it. Traffic patterns followed it. The volunteer fire department scheduled around it. If you lived in Ilion or the neighboring communities of Mohawk, Frankfort, or Herkimer, you lived on Remington time whether you worked there or not. The workforce was overwhelmingly local and heavily multi-generational. Families with 3 and 4 generations at Remington were common. Mayor John Stevens would later say he knew families with 5 great-great-grandfathers who'd worked the barrel line when McKinley was president, their descendants still running machines when Obama was. Your grandfather started in the barrel department. Your father moved up to machining. You came in after high school, maybe after a stint in the military, and found your own spot on the floor. Nobody asked where you went to college, because nobody went to college. You learned a trade. You joined the union. You married someone from the next town over, bought a house you could afford on a factory wage, and you were set. That was the deal. The institutional knowledge, how to feel when a barrel was drilled true, how to read the grain of a walnut blank and know whether it would check or split when you checkered it, how to set a trigger pull to factory specification by touch, passed not through training manuals, but through the hands of the man or woman working the station next to you, who'd learned it the same way from the person before them, in a chain of transmitted skill that reached back decades. The Union was the United Mine Workers of America, Local 7017, a pairing that confused outsiders and amused insiders. A coal miners' union representing gunmakers in a New York valley where no coal had ever been mined. The affiliation was historical. The UMWA had organized aggressively across industrial sectors in the mid-20th century, and Remington's workers had voted them in. The UMWA local served the usual functions: contract negotiation, grievance handling, seniority protection. But in a town like Ilion, it was also a social institution, a gathering point, a place where workers had a collective voice in a community where the factory's management might otherwise have been the only voice that mattered. Union leadership knew the workforce by name. In return, the workforce trusted the union to hold the line on wages, benefits, and the seniority system that determined who worked what shift and who got laid off first when orders slowed. The demographics of the workforce reflected the Mohawk Valley's own immigration history: heavily white working class, with family roots tracing back to the late 19th and early 20th century waves of Italian, Polish, German, and Irish immigrants who'd settled upstate New York to work the factories, farms, and railroads of the region. This wasn't a great migration story like Detroit or Pittsburgh or Gary. The black population in Herkimer County was small, and the factory's racial composition mirrored the surrounding valley. The workforce was bound together less by diversity than by proximity and shared experience. The same high schools, the same Catholic and Protestant churches, the same Little League fields, the same family names appearing on the Remington employee roll year after year, decade after decade, until the distinction between the company's history and the family's history blurred into something indistinguishable. The village itself, population under 8,000, even in the best years, wore the factory's presence in its geography, the way a river town wears the waterline. The multi-story brick plant dominated the center of town, its buildings running along the Mohawk River and fronting Hofler Avenue, visible from nearly every approach road. A visitor driving into Ilion from the New York State Thruway would see the factory before they saw the village: the smokestacks, the long brick facades, the Remington name visible on the building, and understand immediately what this place existed to do. The houses workers lived in were within walking distance or a short drive. The businesses that served them, the diners where the shift change crowds ate, the bars where the evening shift stopped on the way home, the hardware stores and grocers and barbers existed because 3,000 paychecks flowed through Ilion every 2 weeks. Take away the factory and you didn't just lose jobs. You lost the reason the town's commercial infrastructure existed at all. And then there was the museum. The Remington Firearms Museum, established in 1959 and first opened to the public in 1960, was reinstalled in 1980 and occupied space near the custom gun shop entrance at the Ilion plant. It held roughly 2,000 guns, about 250 on display at any given time, along with artifacts of every era the company had passed through. Typewriters from the 1870s and 1880s, sewing machines, cash registers, knives, and even a bicycle. The millionth gun Remington ever produced was there. So was the 10 millionth. Admission was free. You could walk in off the street and visitors did, hunters on their way through the Mohawk Valley, military history enthusiasts, school groups from Herkimer County, the occasional foreign tourist who'd learned that the QWERTY keyboard on their laptop had been invented in this very building. The company also maintained a separate R&D gun library and an archive room, repositories of engineering drawings, prototype records, and technical knowledge accumulated across nearly 2 centuries of continuous firearms manufacturing. An institutional memory that existed nowhere else on Earth. The museum was more than a corporate showcase. It was Ilion's proof of its own significance. Tangible evidence, displayed in glass cases and mounted on walls, that this small village in a rural river valley had shaped the tools that shaped a nation. When workers brought their children through on a Saturday afternoon, they weren't just showing them old guns. They were showing them what their family had been part of. The millionth rifle, the 10 millionth, and in between the ones their grandfather had machined, their mother had inspected, their uncle had packed for shipping. The museum made the abstract concrete. This is what we built here. Chapter 7. The Deer Rifle and the Duck Gun. Outside Ilion, what Remington meant was simpler and larger than any factory tour could convey. It meant the gun in the closet, the gun in the cabinet, the gun your father carried into the whitetail woods the November you were 12 years old and old enough to walk beside him. The Model 700 became the American deer rifle, not by marketing decree, by accumulation. One hunter bought one, carried it into the hardwood ridges of Pennsylvania, or the oak openings of Wisconsin, or the mule deer country of eastern Montana, and told his brother-in-law it was the most accurate rifle he'd ever owned right out of the box. The brother-in-law bought one. His son inherited it. A hunting camp in Michigan's Upper Peninsula might have 4 men sitting around a wood stove on the evening before opening day, and 3 of them were cleaning Model 700s. By the time Remington CEO James Marcatulli tallied the numbers in 2016, more than 6 million Model 700s had been produced, along with nearly 4 million Model 1100 semi-automatic shotguns and 11 million Model 870s. No other American firearms manufacturer had put that kind of volume into hunters' hands. The Model 700's reach crossed every region and every income bracket. The same basic rifle in different calibers and grades went home with a rancher in Wyoming, a paper mill worker in Maine, a dentist in suburban Chicago, and a 17-year-old whose father had saved for 3 months to buy it as a graduation gift. The Model 870 held the same kind of grip on the shotgun side. A farmer in Iowa kept one behind the kitchen door for foxes in the henhouse. A waterfowler on the eastern shore of Maryland ran 3,000 rounds of steel shot through one every season, and it never jammed. A state trooper carried one in the cruiser. The 870 Wingmaster, with its polished blued steel and hand-checkered walnut, was the shotgun you handed down, the one your son opened on Christmas morning and understood, without anyone having to say it, that he'd just been given something that mattered more than its price tag. The military recognized the same qualities the hunters did. In 1966, the Marine Corps adopted a sniper variant of the Model 700 as the M40, a rifle that would serve through Vietnam, through the Gulf War, and into the 21st century with successive upgrades carried by some of the most skilled marksmen on Earth. In 1986, the United States Army adopted its own version as the M24 sniper weapon system. The same action that a deer hunter in Vermont trusted for a clean shot at 150 yards, a military sniper trusted for a lethal shot at 800. It was the highest possible endorsement of the design Mike Walker and his team had built in Ilion a quarter-century earlier. And it meant that for decades, the most capable precision rifles in the American military inventory were being made in the same building by the same workforce as the rifles on the shelves of every sporting goods store in the country. Remington dominated its competitors in a market where dominance was rare and brand loyalty ran deep. Winchester was the old rival, the name on the lever-action rifles that had won the West in popular imagination. But Winchester had stumbled in the post-war decades, plagued by quality problems, labor disputes, and a corporate ownership history that would eventually drive it through its own bankruptcy and closure in New Haven. Browning made beautiful guns at premium prices that put them out of reach for the average working hunter. Mossberg competed on value. solid guns at lower price points, but never matched Remington's reputation for accuracy or fit and finish. Marlin held the lever-action niche. Savage competed in bolt-action rifles but couldn't match the Model 700's market penetration. Sturm, Ruger built a following in handguns and was growing in long guns, but was still the newcomer. Remington held the center, the largest American manufacturer of rifles and shotguns, the company that had developed or adopted more cartridges than any other gun or ammunition maker in the country, and the name that appeared on more American sporting firearms than any other brand. If there was a single company that could claim the title America's gunmaker, the argument started and ended in Ilion, and behind it all for 6 decades stood DuPont, patient, deep-pocketed, blue-chip DuPont, the chemical colossus from Wilmington, Delaware. The company had owned Remington since 1933, and the effect of that ownership on Ilion's culture was something workers didn't fully appreciate until it was gone. DuPont wasn't managing Remington for quarterly returns. It wasn't borrowing against the company's assets to fund acquisitions elsewhere. It wasn't installing cost-cutting consultants or pressuring managers to replace the walnut shop with injection-molded synthetic stocks. It wasn't loading the company with debt. It was running a firearms company the way a wealthy family runs a farm it intends to hold for generations. Invest in the soil. Maintain the equipment. Don't mortgage the land. The capital that flowed from Wilmington to Ilion came from DuPont's chemical profits, from a parent company so large and so diversified that Remington's fortunes barely registered on the corporate balance sheet. The stability came without the anxiety of leverage, without the quarterly pressure of debt service, without the knowledge that someone in a distant office was calculating whether the factory was worth more as a going concern or as a liquidation. DuPont was the last owner Remington would ever have that measured its stewardship in decades rather than deal cycles. But in 1993, DuPont would decide that Remington was a stepchild it no longer needed, and the buyers who arrived to take its place would bring a very different philosophy about what a company was for. By the late 1980s, Remington sat at what looked like an unassailable summit. 3,000 workers in Ilion, the Model 700 and Model 870, at the height of their cultural dominance, government contracts flowing, the big green brand as strong as it had ever been. The company had survived everything the first 2 centuries of American history had thrown at it: the Civil War, a Russian default, the Great Depression, 2 world wars, the post-Vietnam military drawdown, and emerged from each crisis with the factory running and the furnaces hot. But the ground was already shifting. Hunting, the consumer base that bought rifles and shotguns, that kept Ilion's machines turning and the walnut shop stocked, had peaked. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Survey of Fishing, Hunting, and Wildlife-Associated Recreation tracked the numbers with the precision of a census. Hunting participation crested in 1982, when nearly 17 million Americans purchased 28.3 million licenses. By 2016, that number had fallen to just 11.5 million hunters, less than 4% of the national population. The customer base was aging. Baby boomers, who made up roughly a third of all hunters, were reaching 63, 65. Their knees and hips and backs making the November hillside harder to climb each year. The pre-dawn alarm harder to answer. Younger Americans weren't replacing them at anywhere near the rate needed to hold the numbers steady. Suburban sprawl had closed hunting land that had been open for generations. Cultural shifts had moved outdoor recreation toward hiking, cycling, and kayaking, activities that didn't involve firearms and didn't require the mentorship chain that hunting depended on. A father or grandfather who took you out, taught you to read sign, put you on your first deer, handed you the tradition with both hands. When that chain broke, when the father worked 2 jobs and didn't hunt, when the grandfather had passed, when the family had moved from a rural county to a suburb with no accessible land, it rarely mended itself. The customer base that had built Remington into a 3,000-employee operation was contracting, and the contraction was structural, not cyclical. It wasn't coming back. Meanwhile, in Washington, the political ground was moving too. The Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act passed in 1993. The federal assault weapons ban followed in 1994. Neither law directly threatened Remington's core products. Bolt-action rifles and pump shotguns weren't banned, and the Brady Bill's background check requirements added bureaucratic friction rather than product prohibition. But together they signaled a shift in the national political wind. Firearms were becoming a partisan issue in a way they hadn't been before, and the industry was being pushed into a defensive crouch that would shape its corporate culture, its marketing, and its alliances for the next 3 decades. None of this was visible from the factory floor in Ilion in 1992, where the shifts still changed 3 times a day, and the walnut shop still turned out stocks by the thousand. But the numbers were there, in the demographic tables and the license data and the legislative calendar, for anyone who cared to look. Standing at the summit, the view was magnificent, and nobody on that factory floor could see the cliff on the other side. Chapter 8. The Flaw in the Trigger. Long before any private equity firm arrived at the gates of Ilion, long before the leveraged buyouts, the bankruptcies, the courtroom depositions, something was already wrong inside the Model 700, and the men who designed it knew. The Walker Fire Control, patented in 1950 by the same Mike Walker who'd engineered the Model 700 into the most popular bolt-action rifle in America, used a component called a trigger connector, a small part that floated freely inside the mechanism and was supposed to reset each time the trigger was pulled and released. When it worked, the system was crisp and precise, delivering the clean trigger pull that benchrest shooters and hunters prized. When it didn't work, when the connector failed to return to its proper position, the rifle could discharge without anyone touching the trigger, typically on safety release, sometimes on bolt manipulation, without warning, without a finger anywhere near the trigger guard. Walker himself saw the problem early. A 1946 memo, written while the fire control was still in development, warned of what he called a theoretical unsafe condition. A 1947 inspection report was more blunt. This situation can be very dangerous from a safety and functional point of view. A trigger block fix was proposed in 1948 that would have eliminated the failure mode. A Remington patent attorney named A.J. Green reviewed the fix in an August 30, 1948 memo and concluded it was the best design, but noted its disadvantages lay in the high expenditure required to make the conversion. CNBC, whose investigative correspondent Scott Cohn spent years on the story, reported that a 1948 internal analysis estimated the cost of the change at 5.5 cents per gun, plus roughly $21,000 in retooling. 5.5 cents. The company rejected the fix. Over the decades that followed, the Walker trigger went into production in the Model 700 and a long list of other Remington bolt-action rifles, the Model 7, the Sportsman 78, the 710, the 715, the 770, the 600, the 660, the 721, the 722, the 725, and the XP100 pistol. Remington received more than 10,000 written complaints about unintended discharges. Internal records uncovered through litigation showed the company averaged roughly 5 reports per week for 28 years. Dozens of people died. More than 100 were seriously injured. And for decades, Remington's legal strategy was to deny the defect existed and settle individual cases with confidentiality agreements that kept the pattern hidden from the public. On October 23, 2000, in Montana, a 9-year-old boy named Gus Barber was killed when his mother's Model 700 discharged as she was unloading it. Her finger was not on the trigger. She didn't know that the boy had run behind a horse trailer directly into the path of the bullet. What the family did not know, what no one outside Remington's legal department knew, was that their rifle contained the same trigger mechanism that engineers had flagged as dangerous 52 years earlier. Gus's father, Rich Barber, went to the funeral home. He looked at his son and made a promise. I went to the funeral home and looked Gus right square in the eye and said, "Son, it ends here and now," he would later tell CNBC. I promised him I'd never be bought off and I'd never quit until I've effected change. He kept the promise. Over the next 14 years, Rich Barber assembled the largest cache of Remington bolt-action trigger documents outside the company, consulted on litigation nationwide, and became the face of a crusade to force Remington to acknowledge what its own engineers had documented half a century before. The reckoning came in stages. Cohn's CNBC documentary, Remington Under Fire, aired in 2010, bringing the internal memos to national attention. The Pollard versus Remington class action, filed in January 2013, led to a settlement covering an estimated 7.5 million rifles dating back to 1948, offering free trigger retrofits. The response rate was notoriously low. Millions of potentially defective guns remained in circulation, and Remington never admitted the rifles were defective. Meanwhile, the replacement trigger Remington had designed to solve the Walker problem, the X Mark Pro, introduced around 2006, developed its own defect, excess bonding agent that could cause unintended discharge. The X Mark Pro was recalled in 2014 for Model 700s and Model 7s manufactured between May 1, 2006 and April 9, 2014. A fix that would have cost 5.5 cents in 1948 ultimately cost the company its credibility, its legal position, and any remaining claim to the engineering integrity that Mike Walker's name had once represented. Chapter 9. The First Buyout. On October 22, 1993, DuPont announced that it had agreed to sell Remington Arms to Racy Acquisitions, a holding organized by the New York investment firm Clayton, Dubilier, and Rice. The price was roughly $300 million. The deal closed December 1, 1993. Joseph L. Rice III, CD&R's president, had built the firm's reputation on buying what he called the stepchildren of giant parents, divisions that large corporations no longer wanted to manage, but that still had value if restructured under leaner ownership. The same year CD&R bought Remington, it bought General Motors' Allison Gas Turbine Division. The playbook was consistent. Acquire an undervalued industrial asset from a disinterested corporate parent, apply private equity management discipline, and sell at a profit. Remington fit the profile. DuPont recorded a net after-tax gain on the sale and used the $300 million in proceeds primarily to retire debt. After 60 years as a patient, deep-pocketed parent, the kind of owner that invested without leveraging, that measured stewardship in decades, DuPont had decided its gun-making subsidiary was no longer worth the trouble. The popular narrative of Remington's destruction begins in 2007 with Cerberus Capital Management. The real story begins here in 1993 with this transaction. CD&R was the first private equity owner. DuPont's departure was the first break in the chain that had kept Remington stable, capitalized, and unencumbered by acquisition debt since the depths of the Great Depression. What arrived in DuPont's place was not an industrial operator. It was a financial firm. And financial firms, by their nature, view a company not as an organism to be sustained, but as an asset to be optimized. Initially, the change was nearly invisible. CD&R promised no changes to employee numbers, wages, or benefits at Ilion. Sam Renzi, the Ilion operations superintendent, was slated to replace the retiring plant manager John Winsky, a smooth internal succession that signaled continuity. An R&D facility opened in Elizabethtown, Kentucky in 1995. The corporate headquarters migrated to Rockingham County, North Carolina, away from Ilion, but not alarmingly so. The guns kept shipping. The walnut shop kept running. The shifts still changed 3 times a day. If you worked the floor, you might not have noticed that the nameplate on the owner's door had changed. But beneath the surface, the economics were shifting in ways that wouldn't become visible for years. By the mid-2000s, CD&R's stake had been reduced through secondary transactions. Bruckman, Rosser, Sherrill & Coase held 61.3% of the equity, while CD&R retained 13%, controlling 26.6% of the vote. The company had passed through the hands of financial intermediaries without the public or the workforce fully registering what that meant. Remington's workforce had shrunk to roughly 2,100 to 2,300 employees, down from the 3,000 of the DuPont peak, a quiet erosion that happened in small layoffs and unfilled retirements rather than dramatic announcements. The company posted losses in 2003, 2004, and 2005 and managed only about $300,000 in net income in a subsequent year. The structural decline of hunting was compressing the market from one side. The politicization of firearms after the Brady Bill and the assault weapons ban was reshaping the industry's relationship with its own customers from the other. And the ownership structure, leveraged, intermediated, managed by financial professionals rather than people who understood barrels and walnut and triggers, had introduced a logic that the factory floor couldn't see but would eventually feel. The company existed to service its capital structure, not the other way around. Remington was still alive, still making guns in Ilion, but the organism that DuPont had nourished for 6 decades was weaker than it looked, and its immune system, the deep capital reserves, the patient ownership, the willingness to invest without demanding a short-term return, was gone. In 2007, a much larger predator arrived. Chapter 10. The Three-Headed Dog. Cerberus Capital Management, named without apparent irony for the three-headed dog that guards the gates of hell in Greek mythology, was a New York-based private equity firm controlled by Stephen A. Feinberg, a reclusive billionaire so averse to publicity that he once reportedly told his employees that anyone whose name appeared in the press would be fired. In May 2007, Cerberus acquired Remington for approximately $370 million, including roughly $252 million in assumed debt that would sit on Remington's books, not Cerberus's. Feinberg wasn't a gun enthusiast buying a heritage brand out of admiration for what Eliphalet Remington had built. He was a deal-maker executing a thesis. The purchase was not an investment in gun-making. It was the centerpiece of a roll-up, the private equity strategy of acquiring multiple companies in the same industry, consolidating them under one corporate umbrella to capture economies of scale, and then selling the combined entity at a valuation greater than the sum of its parts. Cerberus had created a holding company called Freedom Group, Inc. on March 30, 2007, 2 months before the Remington deal even closed. The strategy was explicit. Buy up the American firearms industry, piece by piece, then exit through an initial public offering that would value the combined entity at roughly $1 billion. Bushmaster Firearms, the AR-15 manufacturer based in Windham, Maine, had already been purchased in April 2006. Remington followed on May 31, 2007. Then DPMS Panther Arms on December 13, 2007. Marlin Firearms and H&R 1871 on January 28, 2008. Then Para USA, Advanced Armament Corporates, Tapco, Dakota Arms, and Barnes Bullets. Each acquisition was another piece on the board. By 2009, Freedom Group reported approximately $848 million in revenue and about $24 million in net income. On paper, the thesis was working. The IPO, the entire reason the roll-up existed, never happened. An S-1 registration was filed with the SEC in October 2009. It was withdrawn in April 2011. The financial markets, the post-2008 lending environment, and the political toxicity of a gun industry IPO combined to kill the exit strategy that justified the acquisition debt. Cerberus was stuck with a gun conglomerate it had never intended to operate long-term, loaded with the debt from a half-dozen acquisitions, and run by a rotating cast of executives who arrived from other industries and departed when the culture or the balance sheet defeated them. Tommy Milner, who'd been Remington's CEO, left for Cabela's in March 2009. Ted Torbeck, an ex-General Electric executive brought in to impose Six Sigma discipline on a company that made rifles, lasted from 2009 to 2010. Robert Nardelli, formerly of Chrysler and Home Depot, companies where his tenure had ended badly and publicly, served as interim. George Colatides C. became chairman and CEO in 2012. 4 CEOs in 5 years. Each one arrived with a different management philosophy, a different set of priorities, a different understanding of what the company was for. None of them had grown up making guns. None of them understood what the workforce in Ilion understood. That the quality of a firearm isn't captured on a balance sheet. That the difference between a gun a hunter trusts with his life and one he returns to the store lies in tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, in wood selected by eye, in knowledge passed hand to hand across decades. The cost-cutting that followed was systematic and devastating. Metal injection molded parts, cheaper to produce, inferior in strength and finish, replace machine components in products where experienced shooters could feel the difference the moment they worked the action. The quality control standards that had maintained Remington's reputation for a century and a half were relaxed under pressure to hit margin targets set by financial owners who understood leverage ratios better than they understood manufacturing tolerances. The walnut stocks that had been Remington's visual signature grew thinner in grade as the better blanks were cut from the supply chain to save cost. Fit and finish suffered. Customers who'd grown up trusting the green box began posting on forums and gun shop counters about triggers that didn't feel right, about wood-to-metal fit that showed gaps, about bluing that wore thin. The erosion was gradual, but unmistakable. A generation of gun owners was learning that the Remington on the shelf in 2012 was not the Remington their father had bought in 1972. The Marlin Firearms acquisition was a case study in how not to absorb a heritage brand. When Marlin's production line was moved from its longtime Connecticut factory to the Remington plant, it arrived with virtually no manufacturing drawings. The institutional knowledge, the accumulated craftsmanship of decades of lever-action rifle production had lived in the heads and hands of the Connecticut workers who weren't part of the deal. Remington's engineers had to reverse engineer the guns. The resulting quality was so poor that gun shop owners and collectors coined a term for the new production, Remlin. The word became shorthand across the firearms community for what happened when financial engineering met precision manufacturing. Marlin's reputation, built over more than a century, was damaged in months. The craftsmanship that had defined America's oldest gunmaker, the hand-fitted walnut, the precision machining, the bluing that gleamed under gun shop fluorescence, was being hollowed out from the inside. The green box still looked the same on the shelf. What was inside it didn't. Chapter 11. Newtown. On December 14, 2012, a 20-year-old man named Adam Lanza entered Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut, carrying a Bushmaster XM15 E2S rifle, an AR-15 pattern semi-automatic weapon that Cerberus had acquired when it bought Bushmaster in 2006, and that Freedom Group now manufactured and marketed under slogans crafted to appeal to a certain idea of masculinity. Consider your man card reissued. Forces of opposition bow down. Those were Bushmaster's advertising lines. Lanza killed 20 children, first graders 6 and 7 years old, and 6 adult staff members before taking his own life. It was the deadliest mass shooting at a grade school or high school in American history. 3 days later, on December 17th, Cerberus announced it would sell Freedom Group. The statement was carefully worded, expressing sympathy, citing respect for the victims, framing the sale as a responsible corporate decision. No buyer materialized at the asking price of roughly $1 billion. The California State Teachers Retirement System, which had approximately $751 million invested with Cerberus funds, and other institutional investors moved to divest from Cerberus entirely. In 2015, Cerberus transferred its stake in the gun business into a separate investment vehicle and distributed $48.6 million to limited partners, opening a door for those who wanted out without requiring an actual sale. Freedom Group was quietly renamed the Remington Outdoor Company, as though changing the name on the letterhead could change what the company had become and what one of its products had done. What the name change couldn't conceal, the depositions eventually would. In a November 2021 deposition taken as part of the Sandy Hook family's lawsuit, as reported by the New York Times in September 2023, the plaintiff's attorney Joshua Koskoff asked George Colatides directly, if there were a shooting every single day using a Bushmaster AR-15, would it still be full steam ahead for the company? Colatides answered, it would be full steam ahead. Asked whether his approach to the business changed after Sandy Hook, he said his commitment was 100% unchanged. The December 20th, 2012 board minutes, recorded 6 days after 20 children were murdered with a product the board oversaw, noted that year-end sales continued to be strong in the wake of the tragedy. Those sentences do not require commentary. They carry their own weight. Meanwhile, the Ilion workforce was being dismantled by degrees. On February 17, 2014, George Colatides stood at a press conference in Huntsville, Alabama, and announced a new Remington plant, a roughly $110 million facility in a non-union right-to-work state. He cited New York's SAFE Act, passed in January 2013 in the aftermath of Sandy Hook, as the catalyst. He called the law unconstitutional. The SAFE Act restricted certain semi-automatic firearms features, expanded the state's assault weapons ban, and tightened background check requirements, none of which directly affected the bolt-action rifles and pump shotguns that were Remington's core business, but all of which signaled a political environment that the firearms industry's leadership considered hostile. AR-15 pattern rifles, R-15 variants, and R-1 1911 pistols would be manufactured in Alabama. About 100 jobs shifted south initially. Yumwa Local 717's president warned publicly about the implications for Ilion's long-term future, and the warning proved prescient. Quality problems plagued the Huntsville operation almost from the start. A new workforce, untrained in Remington's processes, working in a new facility without the institutional knowledge accumulated over 2 centuries in Ilion, was producing guns that didn't meet the standards that the Remington name had once guaranteed. In March 2017, 122 union jobs were cut at Ilion and 39 more in Huntsville. The Ilion workforce, which had stood at roughly 1,300 in 2014, fell towards 600. The parking lot where 3 shifts of workers had once arrived around the clock was more than half empty. The Heritage brand was being scattered across multiple states, multiple product lines, and multiple simultaneous crises. The trigger litigation, the Sandy Hook lawsuit, the failed IPO, the quality collapse, with no coherent strategy and no ownership that cared about anything beyond servicing the debt load the roll-up had created. The company that had survived the Civil War, a Russian default, Two world wars and the Great Depression was now struggling to survive its own owners. Chapter 12. Two bankruptcies. The first bankruptcy came in March 2018. Remington Outdoor Company filed Chapter 11 in Delaware, carrying more than $950 million in debt. The accumulated weight of the Cerberus roll-up, the failed IPO, the operational losses, and the legal exposure from litigation on multiple fronts. The filing had been prepackaged, a restructuring plan announced on February 12th, agreed to by the major creditors in advance, designed to move through the courts quickly. 2 days after the announcement, on February 14, 2018, a 17-year-old student killed 17 people at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. The timing was coincidental. Its effect on the firearms industry's public standing was not. Cerberus lost its equity, wiped out entirely. The creditors, Franklin Resources, J.P. Morgan Asset Management, and Lord Abbett & Co., took control of the reorganized company. First Lion lenders received 82.5 cents on the dollar. The restructuring eliminated between $620 and $700 million of debt and injected roughly $145 million in fresh capital. Remington exited bankruptcy in about 2 months, supported by approximately 97% of creditors. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation and the Marlin Firearms Employees Pension Plan were among the unsecured creditors, workers' retirement security, in other words, subordinated to the banks. But asset managers are not gunmakers. The new owners had no operating strategy, no product development plan, and no long-term commitment to the communities that depended on the factories. They were creditors who'd received equity in lieu of debt repayment, not investors who'd chosen to build a firearms company. Sales had dropped more than 30% in 2017, a decline of roughly $177 million in the first 9 months alone. The Huntsville plant was underperforming. Product quality continued to erode. The Sandy Hook lawsuit was advancing through the Connecticut courts, and the Connecticut Supreme Court had ruled in March 2019 that the case could proceed past the Federal Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. The second bankruptcy came in July 2020. The intervening 2 years had brought no recovery, only continued decline. Sales never rebounded to pre-2017 levels. The product line remained hobbled by quality issues and a damaged brand reputation. The Sandy Hook litigation loomed as an existential liability. 585 workers were laid off without severance. Roughly 600 were furloughed in Ilion. The UMWA picketed over unpaid severance and accrued vacation pay, money the workers had earned and the company refused to honor. Senator Chuck Schumer called on the National Labor Relations Board to investigate. Judge Clifton R. Jessup, Jr. presided over the case in the Northern District of Alabama. The breakup sale that followed dismembered America's oldest gunmaker among 7 buyers for a combined total of at least $155 million. Vista Outdoor paid $81.4 million for the Lenoke ammunition business and the Remington brand and trademarks. Sturm, Ruger bought Marlin Firearms for $30 million and would, within a few years, restore the quality that Freedom Group had destroyed. Sierra Bullets bought Barnes Bullets for $30.5 million. Franklin Armory took the Bushmaster brand. JGE Capital Holdings, the parent of Palmetto State Armory, bought H&R DPMS Advanced Armament Corp. as Parker and Storm Lake. Sportsman's Warehouse took Tapco. And Roundhill Group, a company with roots in real estate and paintball, led by a principal named Richmond Italia, who had built a paintball venture called GI Sport Z, paid $13 million for the non-Marlin firearms business, the Ilion plant, the Lenoir City barrel plant in Tennessee, and the museum. $13 million for America's oldest gunmaker, for the factory where the Model 700 was born. for the ground where Eliphalet Remington had forged a barrel in 1816. Ken Darcy, who became CEO of the new entity called Rem Arms, had reportedly called Italia days before the bidding deadline, with an appeal that was less business pitch than moral argument. Richmond, please look at it. 800 people are going to be out of work. The first gun off the restarted Ilion line in April 2021 would be a Model 870. Rem Arms recalled about 200 UMWA workers. The restart was rocky. New ownership learning an old operation, labor relations strained from the bankruptcy's betrayals. Italia's public comments drew a sharp rebuke from UMWA International President Cecil E. Roberts in February 2021, and the relationship between new ownership and old labor remained tense through protracted negotiations until a 3-year contract was ratified in June 2023. 3 months later, the ground shifted for the last time. On November 8, 2021, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp stood at a podium in LaGrange and announced that Rem Arms would relocate its global headquarters, advanced manufacturing, and research and development to Troup County, Georgia. A $100 million investment promising 856 jobs over 5 years. The Georgia deal was everything Ilion couldn't offer. A new single-story facility designed for modern production, lower operating costs, a non-union workforce, generous state incentives, and distance from the New York regulatory environment that the firearms industry viewed as hostile. Ilion's remaining days were numbered. On February 15, 2022, the Sandy Hook families received their reckoning. 4 insurers for the now bankrupt company agreed to pay the full amount of their coverage, $73 million, settling the lawsuit brought under Connecticut's Unfair Trade Practices Act. The families had argued that Remington's marketing of the Bushmaster AR-15, the man card slogans, the military-style imagery aimed at civilian buyers, constituted reckless promotion. Lead attorney Joshua Koskoff of Koskoff and Beeder, along with Eleanor Sterling and Katie Mesner-Haga, had fought through years of motions, appeals, and a Connecticut Supreme Court ruling in March 2009 that allowed the case past the federal shield law. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear Remington's appeal. It was, as the Boston Globe reported, the largest payout by a gun manufacturer in a mass shooting case. Thousands of internal documents were made public as part of the settlement. Koskoff's summation of what had happened to Remington was direct. This private equity firm destroyed Remington. There was no interest whatsoever in public safety. He also condemned the company for having subpoenaed the murdered children's kindergarten and first-grade school records during the litigation. The families, Nicole Hockley, Mark Barden, Francine Wheeler, Veronique de la Rosa, Lenny Posner, and others who had buried first-graders, achieved something no previous plaintiffs against a gun manufacturer had accomplished. Accountability backed by a dollar figure large enough to register, and the opening of an internal documentary record that exposed how the company had been run. On November 30, 2023, Rem Arms Director of Benefits and Compensation, Brian Wheatley, sent a letter to Mayor John Stevens and the UMWA. Operations in Ilion would conclude on or about March 4, 2024. The warn notice listed 309 of the 310 remaining workers. 28 would stay through June to decommission the building. UMWA International President Cecil Roberts called the announcement a slap in the face and added with a bitterness that carried the weight of everything the union had endured, "Merry Christmas from Rem Arms." A February 2024 agreement between the UMWA and Rem Arms provided 12 weeks of severance payments beginning in April, plus accrued vacation pay. It was the last contract the union would ever negotiate for Remington workers in Ilion. Chapter 13. What Remains. The workers scattered into a labor market that had room for them but couldn't replace what they'd lost. Herkimer County. Working Solutions, managed by Nicole Wilson, ran sessions inside the plant before it closed, connecting employees with regional employers. Revere Copper in Rome, Pursuit, Riverhawk, Hubbard. One worker's husband took a job at the Revere Copper plant, a commute, a different trade, a different rhythm. The New York State Department of Labor, through spokesperson Deanna Cohen, cited roughly 2,500 openings in the Mohawk Valley. The openings were real, but openings and equivalents are different things. A 20-year machinist at Remington had a trade honed over decades, a seniority number that reflected his place in a community, a pension that represented a promise, a daily routine organized around a factory whistle that had been blowing since before his grandparents were born. A job at a different factory in a different town. Building something other than guns was employment. It paid the bills. It wasn't the same thing. The identity that came from making something that mattered, something that hunters carried into the field and soldiers carried into war, couldn't be transferred along with a resume. Ilion went quiet the way factory towns go quiet. Not all at once, but in the small subtractions that accumulate until one day you look around and the place feels different. Mayor Stevens estimated the annual revenue loss at $950,000 to $1 million, most of it from the municipal electric utility that had powered Remington's machines under a favorable rate negotiated in 2010 and 2011. Remington had been Herkimer County's largest employer. Dolgeville's mayor, Mary Posnowski, warned of a trickle-down effect through the surrounding communities, the suppliers, the diners, the gas stations, the small contractors who had done business with the plant for decades. Each closure, each contraction, each family that moved away to follow work was a small subtraction. Together they made a different town. The plant itself, 1.1 million square feet of multi-story brick and steel, the oldest continuously operated firearms factory in America until it wasn't, was listed for sale at $10 million. Turin Management, a women-owned New York development company led by CEO Kristen O'Neill, purchased it through a holding entity for roughly $2.1 million, a fraction of the asking price. A fraction of what the operation inside it had once been worth. In January 2026, Turin submitted a New York State Department of Environmental Conservation Brownfield Cleanup Program application for a 250,000 square foot AI data center on a portion of the site. Permit filings and developer projections suggested the full property could eventually support 200 megawatts of capacity with $2 to $3 billion in investment. Numbers that were projections, not commitments, drawn from applications rather than completed construction. What was confirmed was this: the site was contaminated with heavy metals, including arsenic and mercury exceeding state regulations, requiring remediation before anything could be built. Community opposition, a petition, village board pushback, had emerged by the spring of 2026. The data center was proposed, not built, not certain. The Remington Firearms Museum, roughly 2,000 guns, including the millionth and 10 millionth ever produced, plus the typewriters and sewing machines and the bicycle, had not been open to the public since the 2020 bankruptcy. On November 6, 2024, the iconic factory sign directing visitors to the museum was taken down. The final disposition of the collection remained unconfirmed in the public record. Collectors speculated about a move to LaGrange. The Remington Society of America continued its work of preserving the documentary record. But the physical artifacts, the guns that traced the full arc from flintlock to bolt action to semi-automatic, all made on the same ground, were behind closed doors, in a building that was being decommissioned on contaminated soil, in a village that was learning to live without the thing that had given it a name. Rem Arms still makes guns. In LaGrange, Georgia, on a modern factory floor, the Model 700 and the Model 870 are still produced. The green box is still green. The brand name is still Remington. But the Remington ammunition that loads those guns is made by a different company. Vista Outdoors Ammunition Arm became the Kinetic Group, sold to Czechoslovak Group in 2024. The consumer who buys a Remington rifle and a box of Remington cartridges is buying from two unrelated companies sharing a name and a color. The brand that once meant one thing, made in one place, by one workforce, was split between strangers. In Ilion, the brick buildings still stand along the Mohawk River, at the bend where the Erie Canal once ran, on the ground where Eliphalet Remington forged a barrel in 1816 because his father wouldn't give him the money to buy a rifle. 208 years of continuous manufacturing, through the Civil War, through a Russian Revolution, through 2 world wars and a depression, and the long, slow decline of hunting in America, ended not because the market rejected what Remington made. The Model 700 was still the deer rifle. The Model 870 was still the pump shotgun. People still wanted them. It ended because 2 waves of financial ownership valued the company not for what it built, but for what could be extracted from it. The debt that funded the roll-up, the cost-cutting that degraded the product, the quality collapse that alienated the customer, the trigger defect that killed and maimed for decades while the fix sat in a filing cabinet, rejected to save 5.5 cents a gun. And in the end, a $13 million price tag for a company that had armed the Union, supplied the Tsar, equipped the Marines, and put a rifle in the hands of 6 million American hunters. The furnaces in Ilion are cold now. The walnut shop is empty. The last shift walked out at 10 in the morning on a Monday in March because there was nothing left to build. And in the silence that fills a factory that has been running for 2 centuries, a silence that doesn't belong there, that sits heavier than quiet in a building that was never meant to be still. What remains is the record, the names, the dates, the decisions, the cost, and somewhere, in a hall closet or a gun cabinet, or mounted on pegs above a mantel, in a farmhouse in Pennsylvania, or a ranch house in Montana, or a split level in Ohio, a Model 700 with a walnut stock and blued steel barrel still sits where it was placed decades ago. The grain of the wood still warm to the touch, the action still smooth when you work the bolt, the Ilion proof mark still stamped on the barrel. Made in Ilion, New York, by hands that aren't there anymore, in a factory that isn't there anymore, for a company that survived everything except the people who owned it last.